Give us a little background on those and your current teaching and so forth.
Well, I'm originally from North Carolina, and I grew up in North Carolina and Florida. And so much of the work that I had been doing in my early part of my academic career was about Southern history. So I did a book, my first book coming out of graduate school was about professional and commercial Southerners before the Civil War and what they had to do about secession and the coming of the war. It's called The Origins of the Southern Middle Class. I did another book on women writers and journalists that was about both Black and white women who edited their own newspapers and magazines, both before and after the Civil War. But then I started to get interested in this fugitive slave issue, which we can certainly talk more about. And that led me to some lectures I gave in 2017, and then a book that came out in 2019. And by necessity, that was about the pre-Civil War North, because it's the northern communities, the northern states that really had to confront the issue of the fugitive slave law, the fugitive slave clause that's in the Constitution.
Okay.
And so led me to the Kidnapping Club.
Let me just interject. I was going to say perfect timing. Let me just interject. I'm Lee Wright. I'm the founder of History Camp. I'm near Boston, and with me in Virginia is. Oops, Carrie. I think it's a little quiet.
Let's see. I'm Carrie Lund, the director of the Pursuit of History. That is the nonprofit that brings these History Camp discussions to you every week. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are excited to have with us author Jonathan Daniel Wells. Dr. Wells is a social, cultural, and intellectual historian and is a professor of history at the Residential College University of Michigan. He is the author of 10 books, including our subject tonight, The Kidnapping Club, Wall Street, Slavery, and Resistance on the Eve of the Civil War. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, John.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Carrie. I appreciate it.
It's a fascinating topic. Let's set the stage for folks and help them understand. Maybe start with the big picture. So the United States, the North and the South, and then New York City. Give us a sense of what's going on.
Sure. Thanks so much for that question, Lee. So coming out of the colonial period, the northern states had pretty much begun to eliminate slavery, either, pretty abruptly or provided for the gradual emancipation of Black people who had been enslaved in states like Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts. And that sort of set the stage for the constitutional compromises that had to be created in order for Southerners and Northerners to be able to form a union together. And while the South increasingly became beholden to slavery, in large part because of the invention of the cotton gin in the 1790s and the need to grow as much cotton as it could, and the need, therefore, the choice to use Black enslaved labor to grow that cotton, became sort of the mantra of the American South. But as I said, in the North, it was a different story. They always had enslaved people going back to the colonial period, but by the time the Constitutional Compromise is drafted in Philadelphia in 1787, most of the states had begun planning for the end of enslavement. And it wasn't necessarily a hard decision for them to make because there weren't many enslaved people in those states anyway. So the Constitution is a fascinating document. Many historians, including people like Gordon Wood and James Oakes, and many others, Sean Wilentz, have made the case that the Constitution as our founding document is what makes all of the future progress in terms of basic human rights in the United States possible. So this is what allows African Americans to declare their desire for civil rights and ultimately to the end of slavery and emancipation and ultimately to female suffrage in the United States and so on. And so for some historians, the Constitution is part of a story of the unfolding of democracy. Other historians view it a bit differently. They view it as more of a sort of obfuscation with slavery or an attempt to elide many of the controversies over slavery, having a United States from its very birth be a place where you had two different economic systems, one based on slavery and one not. And for our purposes tonight, and for the book that I've written, The Kidnapping Club, it's important to realize that one stipulation in the original Constitution provided for the return of runaways. It's called the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution. And it stipulated that if somehow, against tremendous odds and against the personal risk to your life that it would have entailed, if somehow you were able to leave slavery, either by stowing away on a ship or bribing a ship's captain to take you, say from the port of Norfolk to a free port in New York or Boston, or you managed to walk or pose as a white person, whatever mechanism that you utilized to become a runaway in the eyes of the law, did not mean that you were free. That in fact, those communities that you now tried to make your home, whether it was New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, Cleveland, whatever, those communities were required by the Constitution to return you to your quote unquote master. So this is the background against which this group called the Kidnapping Club is able to operate pretty much with impunity all throughout the 1830s and 1840s. And it rendered New York City a very precarious, fragile place for Black people, whether they were in fact runaways from plantations in Virginia or South Carolina or elsewhere in the South, or whether they had been in fact born free. Many of your watchers, your listeners will know the story of Solomon Northrop, who was kidnapped in upstate New York, and for 12 years lived under slavery until he had a happy ending, which of course was extremely unusual. But the book that I've written is not so much about New York State or other places of the North. It's specifically zeroed into New York City. And the reason is because, and I say this in the book, and it's not something I take lightly, New York City in the pre-Civil War period is the most pro-slavery, pro-South city north of the Mason-Dixon line. And it's really contrary to our conception of New York today, isn't it? We think of New York City quite rightly as a politically progressive place where pluralism flourishes, and we see people from all around the world come and live in the New York area. But unfortunately, that present story of New York City is based on a much bleaker history. And that's what the book is about. It's about the ways in which the entire political system, pretty much, the legal system, the police force, many of the financiers and merchants in and around Wall Street, they are all arrayed against the interests of Black people in New York City. And we can talk a little bit more, if you'd like, about what makes New York City so specifically pro-slavery and pro-South. But I think that's really what's behind my intention in writing the book.
Okay, and I would like to go there. Let me ask first, though, is something roughly similar happening in Detroit, Cleveland, Boston, Philadelphia, and so forth? Perhaps not to the same degree, but the same actions, same forces at work?
The short answer is yes, but not to the same degree.
Okay.
So you do see this happening in places like Boston and Philadelphia, and especially. One of my friends has written a book. His name is Richard Bell. He's a professor at the University of Maryland, and he's written a book called Stolen, which is about the notorious Patty Cannon gang, actually a ring of slave catchers that was headed up by a woman in the 1820s, and she and her gang members would go into the streets of Philadelphia and literally kidnap Black people, especially children, and take them into bondage to the South and sell them as slaves, even though they didn't care whether those people were in fact runaways or born free. So it did indeed happen in other cities, and it was pretty awful, the unfolding events in places like Philadelphia, as Richard Bell tells in his book. But I do think New York is unusual. It's almost unique in the levels to which they are willing to stoop to make life miserable for African Americans.
Well, let's talk more then about New York, about what caused it to really be as extraordinary as it was, and perhaps some of the people involved.
So there are two reasons why New York is particularly pro-South, and I think even to some degree pro-slavery. One of them is the fact that the city is building much of its power, much of its wealth here. I mean, this is the period, the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, when New York City is in fact emerging as one of the world's great financial centers to rival London. And it's doing that in large part because it facilitates the cotton trade that is going on in the South. So the South becomes one of the wealthiest sections of the world. I think sometimes we assume that because the South was dominated in its economy by slavery, that it was, poor and backward. And of course, inequality was horrendous, but it's also extremely wealthy. And in part, that's because all of those tens of thousands of bales of cotton that are being grown and harvested by enslaved people, that is all being baled up, taken to the markets and the ports around the South. And then ultimately the destination are the textile factories in New England or the textile factories in the United Kingdom. And New York City merchants and shippers and financiers, insurance companies, they are all facilitating all of these, this movement of cotton from raw material in the South to, the places where they'll be turned into finished products like fine linens and curtains and clothing. So part of the reason why this happens in New York to such a degree is because New York is very much enmeshed in probably in unique ways in the United States with the cotton trade in the South. The other thing I'll just mention quickly, the other reason why New York is unusual in terms of its attachment to the South and slavery is because it's a very democratic city. And I mean Democratic Party city. And your watchers and listeners will be aware of the fact that the parties are very different today than they were back in this period of American history, almost 180 degrees. In this period of American history, the Democratic Party is the reactionary party when it comes to race. And for the life of them, New York's Democratic Party leaders couldn't understand why we would jeopardize the national compact, the constitutional compromises that had made the United States possible, and by the way, all the prosperity that's been taking place under the umbrella of the Union. So it's just shocking to them, the Democratic leaders of New York City, that people would even entertain the idea of placing the interests of Black people or civil rights over the need to return runaways. And they were all too willing to make these sacrificial victims of Black New Yorkers, whether they were men, women, or children, in order to show the South that they were solidly behind the Union, that they were committed to remaining a partner in the cotton trade. And those were the two main factors, the cotton trade and the Democratic Party dominance of the city, that really made New York City sort of unique in this way.
Well, let's go to some of the people involved, but first, give us a sense of numbers, roughly. And we didn't talk in advance, like, hey, let's cover this. So this may not be something that you've got readily available, but do you have a sense of the population of New York at the time, New York City that is, and white versus free Blacks?
Yeah, so New York is on its way toward 500,000 people, by the time we get to the late 1840s. So in the 1830s, the population number is about 350,000. Only about 15 to 20,000 of them are Black. So that's a really small number, and it remained small pretty much until the 20th century. And in part, that's because the vast majority of American African Americans live in the South under enslavement. And it's not really until the 20th century when we get the great migrations, the first and second migrations, that we will get larger influxes of Black Southerners moving to the North. And so, despite all that, and this is something I really take pains to cover in the book, because it can be a really dark story. It is a dark story about the kidnapping of human beings and the carelessness with which they were treated, and especially when it came to children. But I take pains in the book to say that even though we're only talking 15 to 20,000 Black New Yorkers, they had created these really vibrant, vigorous communities all across Manhattan and into Brooklyn. Many of your listeners will know about Weeksville, which was an important community in Brooklyn. And you can still go today. I'm not sure it's open because of COVID, but you can certainly check it out online. There's a great visitor center there and some older buildings still standing. In Manhattan, we had Seneca Village, which was a very vigorous and vibrant Black community that was pretty much wiped off the map to make room for Central Park. So I think it's important to realize, we're talking about small numbers here, but these are people who had been in New York sometimes for generations and built roots there and had families there. And it was just tremendously unfortunate that the city didn't recognize the value of the Black communities it had and didn't do more to protect the interests of the city's African Americans.
Well, let's talk about some of the individuals involved on both sides.
Yeah, sure. So I should mention before we get too much more into the discussion that the Kidnapping Club is a name that was given to this group by a very prominent Black abolitionist named David Ruggles. And I first read about David Ruggles through the biography of him that's been done. Great biography if your watchers are interested, by historian Graham Hodges. And David Ruggles was just an amazing human being. He was a tireless advocate on behalf of racial justice. Really, somebody who would be on a par with Frederick Douglass in this period of American history. That's how amazing a human being he was. And he's the one that labels this group the Kidnapping Club. He calls them the New York Kidnapping Club, actually. And it's a group of not really people who socialized. It's not an official club per se, but he lumped them together because the police officers and the judges and the slave catchers who really spared no expense, or they were perfectly willing to use every means at their disposal to make Black lives expendable. One of them is a guy named Tobias Boudinot, and he and his buddy Daniel Nash, they're police officers and marshals in New York City before the Civil War, and they're kind of some of the villains in the story. They again don't care whether somebody's been a resident of New York for 30 years, or whether they had been born free in New York City, or whether they were, in fact, somebody who was a runaway. What they were doing was they were going around the streets, the alleyways of Lower Manhattan, and patrolling for victims. And what they would do is they would return those people if they were in fact runaways, or simply, declare that somebody was in fact a runaway and reap the reward money from the so-called master from whom that person had escaped. They would bring their victims before the city recorder, a guy named Richard Riker. And, he's another sort of villain at the apex of the Kidnapping Club. And sometimes Boudinot, the police officer, would bring a victim before Riker's court. He was the city recorder. And unfortunately for Black New Yorkers, he's the one who's charged with deciding whether somebody is, in fact, a runaway or not. And within hours, sometimes even before the victims' families knew they were missing, Riker would declare the person a runaway and send that person into bondage. So Ruggles is the one who calls them out by name. And he does this through his occupation. He is a journalist. And he publishes a newspaper called The Mirror of Liberty. And within the pages of this periodical, this magazine, David Ruggles recounts in incredibly vivid detail, sometimes, conversations word for word about his encounters with the Kidnapping Club. And, if it weren't for Ruggles, I probably couldn't have written this book, or at least I couldn't have recreated the stories with such richness. He's the one, that allows us to go back to the historical record and recover some of these stories that would have been lost to history. So, club is sort of a label that Ruggles slaps on them, but there's certainly a pretty efficient machinery when it comes to the cheapening of Black lives.
To what extent was the population generally aware of what was going on and supportive or indifferent, or were there groups, Black or white, that tried to intervene, tried to save some of these individuals?
Yeah, that's a great question. Ruggles is unique. I mean, there's nobody like him. He is the one who's constantly walking around New York. He patrols the wharves around the Battery and the East River and the Hudson River, in his search for any hints of any kind of injustice, anybody accused of being a runaway without evidence. Or perhaps, and this is another part of the story we can talk about if you'd like, New York City being a port in the slave trade, which had been illegal since the early part of the 19th century. And yet here we are as late as the onset of the Civil War. So 1860, in 1861, New York City is a port along with Havana and Western Africa in the illegal slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. So there's really nobody like Ruggles. He's in a league of his own. But there were certainly Black and white abolitionists in New York City. And if anybody's interested in this part of the story, I would urge you to check out Eric Foner's Gateway to Freedom. Eric Foner, of course, being one of our great historians. One of his more recent books was about the anti-slavery movement in New York City. People like Sidney Gay and the Tappins and others who helped to form this group called the New York Committee of Vigilance. And they were supposed to sort of, fall into line or come into gear when news of a runaway reached the city streets or the Black community. They would be there trying to line up legal defenses, try to raise money for the hiring of lawyers, try to provide evidence to prove the innocence of somebody. So there is, in fact, a significant anti-slavery, interracial, biracial community. Unfortunately for Black New Yorkers, they are a tiny minority of the city. And the vast majority of the residents of New York who are white either are hostile to Black people or simply don't care. And in the hostile category, you could certainly place many of the Democratic Party leaders, the working class Irish people who resented the infiltration, as they saw it, of Black workers into the shipyards or into the warehouses or factories, the competing for jobs. And, in the moderate category, in terms of people who just really didn't think much about it, that was probably where a lot of New Yorkers were, a lot of white New Yorkers, I mean. People who said, slavery is a Southern problem. What do I have to do with it? It's not my concern. It's for, the people in South Carolina or in Texas to deal with. But the fact, and this was a really interesting question for me as I was not just writing this book, but the last book I did in 2019, And that is, what happens over time to this Northern public opinion? These people who were sort of fence sitters or, didn't really think about slavery or the rights of Black people very much. How does that change over time? And how does that contribute to our understanding of the coming of the Civil War? Because when we think about the causes of the war, we know that slavery is at the root of the causes of the war. But as one historian said, that's opening up more questions than solving and providing answers. So the fact that we often think about slavery and the South and secession as the sort of causes leading up to the Civil War, we forget sometimes that Northerners had to come to the conclusion too, that there was something fundamentally wrong with the Constitution, with its compromises over slavery. And the longer these issues of fugitive slave crises go on, the more kidnappings that take place in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, the more stories reach the newspapers of New York participating in the illegal transatlantic slave trade. All of those make it much harder for fence-sitting white New Yorkers to say, slavery is a Southern problem. What do I have to do with it? It's not really my business. Well, the fugitive slave crisis makes it their business. And so, they had to evolve in their opinion too. And many of them are saying, look, I don't believe in racial equality, but on the other hand, I believe in the right of Massachusetts not to have slavery. And we see this interesting sort of turning on its head of the states' rights argument, right? Because in the South, we're familiar with states' rights being, not only a fundamental cause of, sort of South Carolina's push for nullification in 1828 to 1832, but also in secession itself in 1860 and 61. But Northerners are forming their own states' rights ideology too. They want the right to keep slavery outside their border, and they don't appreciate, many of them, being made accomplices to Southern slavery through the Fugitive Slave Clause or the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. So, there's a really interesting story to be told here. And I say white Northerners, of course, because Black Northerners had already come to the conclusion, quite obviously, that, slavery was immoral, illegitimate, and represented a compromise with evil. But the change over time that we see in white public opinion in the North, I think, is really interesting too.
And over what time period did that occur roughly? And give us a sense also of the magnitude of the activity, and then perhaps ultimately tapering off. But how many people were captured, kidnapped, and sent south? And over what time period did this general public opinion change?
So I wish I had a good answer on the numbers. That's something that we as historians, kind of struggle with, because we'd like to have numbers, right? Because that's part of telling, the story and relaying its importance, its significance. But by nature, these are things that were clandestine in some ways, particularly as we get to the 1840s and 1850s, when Boudinot and Nash and others are finding it a little bit more challenging to simply whisk somebody away off the streets of New York and to send them into slavery in the South within a matter of hours. One of the things that makes that harder is the institution of jury trials. So by the 1840s now, we're beginning to see jury trials being required in cases of fugitive slave accusations. So, we have a situation where you're going to be able, hopefully, to present evidence that establishes you're not Joe Smith, who ran away from a Virginia plantation in 1830. You are, in fact, who you say you are, Joe Lockley, who was born in New York City and had been living there for 35 years. So that's really an important shift that changes by the 1840s. But the truth is, the kidnappings of Black people in New York City is going on all throughout the pre-Civil War period, and all the way up until the eve of the Civil War. up until 1860, 61.
What brought about that critical change, the introduction of jury trials?
Well, that's a really important point. It's part of the story of the changing of Northern public opinion. The Fugitive Slave Clause that's established in the Constitution says pretty clearly that if you're running away, that doesn't mean you're free. You have to be returned by law. But there was no teeth in that clause. There's no real bureaucracy or any kind of government mechanism to make that happen. And that leads to some loopholes in some Northern communities, like Boston, for example, that passes what are called liberty laws. And these liberty laws say, well, yeah, of course we recognize that there's the clause in the there's a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution, but if you're going to adhere to that or enforce that, you're not allowed to use our city jails to make it happen. Or, placing some of these other obstacles in the way to fugitive slave renditions. And so that leads to a new law, possibly, and this is saying a lot, possibly the worst law ever passed by the United States Congress. And that was the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. That was part of the compromise measures in 1850 that were designed to, supposedly settle this issue of slavery once and for all. That's sort of what politicians like Stephen Douglas and Henry Clay and others thought they were doing in drafting these measures. And instead, when the Fugitive Slave Law became public in the fall of 1850, when Northern communities, and of course, again, I'm talking about white communities because Black Northerners were already well convinced about what was the truth about slavery. They were up in arms. There were protests that developed all across the North, including in New York City, that the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 was not only making Northern communities complicit in slavery, but was in fact turning the North into one vast hunting ground. And it terrorized Black people. Many of them left the United States and went across the border to the real land of the free, which was Canada, so that they're out of the reach of the federal government in the United States. And for white Northerners, again, we don't have Gallup poll numbers. So I can't say, the number of abolitionists in the North went from, 15% to 30%. We just don't have that kind of specificity. But we certainly know that the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 enraged many formerly moderate, fence-sitting white Northerners who thought, slavery is not my problem. Well, now it is their problem. It's brought to their doorsteps in their communities. It's making their citizens in their neighborhoods vulnerable to Southern bondage. So that's that's part of the fury that develops in the North. And then, we see a series of unfolding, almost every 6 months or a year in the 1850s, one more, thorn in the side of the Union that will ultimately lead us to civil war.
When did this ultimately come to a stop? Was it with the first shots of the Civil War?
Do you mean specifically the kidnapping?
Yes.
Yeah, that's pretty much the end of it. By the time we get to the 1850s, and this is an interesting sort of contradiction, by the time we get to the 1850s, the kidnappings are on the wane. They're declining. And it's becoming increasingly difficult for white Southerners to claim that so-and-so is a runaway and needs to be returned. Excuse me. But ironically, it's at that same time in the 1850s that New York's participation in the illegal transatlantic slave trade is at its height. And if your listeners, your watchers are interested in this, there's a new book called The Last Slave Ships by my friend John Harris, which is about the ways in which New York was just this shockingly callous place when it came to participation in the slave trade. And that is another thing that many white Northerners, white New Yorkers in this specific example, couldn't countenance. They weren't believed in racial equality. They might believe, like Lincoln did, that slavery was an evil, but one that could be contained in the South. But the idea that you were still going across the Atlantic Ocean to kidnap people from Africa and take them as slaves into Cuba or elsewhere in the New World was a bridge too far for many, even conservative white Northerners. I should mention too, that a lot of these stories have been written about in different ways by historians. One that I found really valuable was a book by Leslie Harris, which is about New York City and slavery, really from the earliest days until the draft riots of 1863. It's a great book, and I would urge your listeners to check it out. There's another one by Leslie Alexander, which is about slavery in New York and Black communities. And if you're interested in learning more about Seneca Village, she does an amazing job of recounting or recovering that neighborhood that had been in fact wiped out to create Central Park.
John, you're the most gracious of all of the authors we've had. No one has done as much as you have in recognizing the books of others. So that's extremely helpful. And we'll see if we can work with you and get a list of those, and then we'll include those in the notes.
Absolutely.
So that would be great. Why don't you take us through the story of one or two individuals, and let's really help people understand what this meant.
So I think one of the more painful, if not the most painful story in the entire book is the story of young Henry Scott, who is a 7-year-old child. And one day he is sitting at his school desk in the African Free School. So one of the great things that, New York's African-American community had done was to encourage the building of these free schools, these public schools for Black children. And by the way, African-American women in the communities, in the neighborhoods of the city, were raising money to buy clothing for kids so that they could, go to school in respectable clothing. And here is Henry Scott practicing his letters in the early 1830s. And then out of the blue, the door to the classroom bursts open. And in walks two white men. One is a sheriff, and the other is a white North Carolinian who claims that Henry Scott is in fact his property. And as the white Southerner claims, Henry Scott had been taken as a boy, a young boy, even younger, by his father, who was also supposedly a runaway slave. They had run away from a plantation in Virginia and had found a precarious freedom in New York City. And you can just imagine what happens in this classroom of grade schoolers. They completely start shrieking and crying. They run out of the classroom. They yell, "Kidnappers, kidnappers." And Henry Scott, along with his father, is actually taken to prison, which is what happened to people who were accused of being runaways. They were taken to jail while the truth, or to what extent you could ascertain the truth of their freedom or their status as runaways, was determined. And, this was something that scarred the Black community for a generation. There were these sort of moving stories of other Black children in the city who learned about the case of Henry Scott, and they went about their parents and grandparents and communities gathering up pennies. So the girls in one school collected $2.15 to contribute to Henry Scott's legal defense. This is something that really mobilized the community, and it was felt by everybody, particularly when it came to kids. As it turns out, I think the legal system, in this case, Richard Riker, who's the city recorder, is very much predisposed to declaring Henry Scott and his father are in fact runaways, but their freedom is purchased by the accumulated money that was raised. And this was something that was really troubling for abolitionists, anti-slavery activists. I mean, because by buying somebody's freedom, you're in essence acknowledging the legitimacy of slavery in some way, right? That this is a transaction that needs to take place, and that they are in fact, human property. And not only that, it's enriching, a slave owner. But many, both black and white abolitionists are sort of willing to put aside those trepidations because, people's lives are at stake. So ultimately, Henry Scott's freedom will be purchased. But that's one of the more darker stories, but there are many others. There's a woman named Hester Carr who is pretty much tricked into leaving New York City. She might have had some kind of disability, perhaps even a cognitive disability of some kind. And she's tricked into leaving New York, even though she's a free person. And she ultimately is sold into slavery. And she dies in a jail being prepared to be sold as a slave in Virginia. And she's only, basically in her 20s. So, as dark as these tales are, and boy, are they difficult for me to write and for folks to read about, I'm sure. You have to sort of take solace in some ways in the tremendous bravery and the tireless activism and the commitment to racial justice that many of these people exhibited. And I'm not just talking about David Ruggles and many others, Thomas Van Rensselaer, Thomas Downing, Charles B. Ray. These are all prominent black activists, Samuel Cornish, Philip Bell in New York City, but also, some of these very people who were being rendered victims of the New York Kidnapping Club, going to court, sort of sometimes in suffering from humiliating trials where, they have to lift up their shirt to say, well, here's a scar, that's described by the master in his, reward ad. They're just dehumanizing trials. And yet, they put themselves through it, not just because they know their own freedom is at stake, but that the whole illegitimacy of the institution can be exposed by them sort of bringing more and more of these cases to court.
Fascinating. Another individual, and this is one of the questions, you got Solomon Northrop, who is the subject of the movie. Was this what he was the fate that befell him?
Yes, it's the same instance. His is the most famous example. And he wrote a memoir, 12 Years a Slave, that was published in 1853. He had been kidnapped in 1841. And those who have watched the movie on which the memoir is based know that he was, or have read the memoir, he was a great musician. And he was promised some pretty good wages for a gig in Washington, D.C. And something happened where the way he recounts it is he thinks the two people that he was with, the two white people who were helping organize his performance, were in fact all the while intending to sell him into slavery. And they put something in his drink or in his food, and he woke up the next morning, and he was in chains, and his free papers were missing. And this is something that I think sometimes modern observers forget, that if you were a free black person, whether it was in the South or in the North, you were supposed to carry free papers. And they're literally paper documents that say, I, John Wells, was born in Saratoga Springs, New York in 1815. And I was born to free parents, and therefore I am a free person. I am 5'9", darker complexion, heavy set. I have a scar on my left, cheek. That's how dehumanizing, how humiliating some of these things were. But these are vital papers, right? Because they're the testament to your status as a non-slave. And those were easily stolen or lost. And that's what happened to Solomon Northrop. And you know, the movie is such a great movie. I think it's one that is extremely painful to watch, and I would certainly warn, you know, anybody who hasn't seen it to watch it, but also watch it with an eye toward, you know, some pretty tough scenes that are visualized in that movie. But it's such a good movie. So yeah, this is basically what's happening to people in New York City. The same thing that happens to Solomon Northup. The one difference, of course, being that Solomon Northup manages to gain his freedom. The movie sort of crosses the threshold. This is one of the differences between the movie and the book. In the book, Solomon says, "Look, I can't convey to you as a reader how powerful it was for me finally, after 12 years of enslavement, to see my family again. You know, his children had grown. You know, his wife had aged. He had had a grandchild born. And here he was, you know, he said, I can't go there. I can't take you there." The movie does, however, cross the threshold into the family home. And it's just one of the most powerful scenes in all of cinematic history, as far as I'm concerned. Unfortunately, for the vast majority of people who are kidnapped, including pretty much all of the people that I write about, are never going to see freedom again once they are taken into the bowels of Southern slavery. And in part because it's so easy for slave traders to create this false paper trail, right? All you need is a handwritten receipt that says you bought so-and-so, you know, a month ago at a market in New Orleans. And then you sell that person to somebody else in Texas. And then that person sells them to, you know, a plantation owner in Georgia. And pretty soon your free history is erased. And that was, you know, especially true with children, right? Because their features changed so quickly that, you know, fairly soon they would not even be recognizable to their own loved ones. So this is a part of American history that is dark, it is difficult, it is troubling, but it's a part of our history nonetheless.
One last question here from Kevin. The 5 Points area of New York City was at the time pretty anti-immigrant. Are there any similarities here, or did that play any role?
So 5 Points is a really interesting area of New York City. And another colleague of mine, Tyler Anbinder, has written extensively. He has a book on 5 Points. And it's really a fascinating read. So, you know, Charles Dickens went there. He had even heard about the notorious poor and violent and decrepit 5 Points. So he wanted to go see it for himself when he came to tour America in 1841 or thereabouts. It was a place in which Black people lived, but also poor Irish working class people. It was violent. It was dilapidated. It was unsanitary. And it's where, you know, a lot of the poor communities, the poorest community perhaps in New York City was. And unfortunately, it's where the New York Kidnapping Club, in fact, finds a lot of its victims. It's a place where Boudinot and Nash, for example, the police officers who are sort of at the forefront of the Kidnapping Club, they find a lot of their victims in the 5 Points area. But, you know, I think it'd be a mistake perhaps to think of that's all that there is to Black New York before the Civil War. Because as I was, again, trying to say earlier, you know, there are communities that are vibrant and lively, and they have churches and schools and, you know, stable families and communities that rely on one another. And, you know, that's an important part of the story as well.
Okay, absolutely. Well, John, thanks very much. Carrie lets me know that, let's see, Carrie, are we going to give it a try, or shall I wrap up?
I will give it a try. As you know, my internet does not always cooperate. So thank you so much, John. This has been very thought-provoking. It's certainly a difficult part of our history, but one that we need to know about. So we appreciate you coming on and sharing this with us tonight. So next week, we will be speaking with Stephen Bown about the Hudson's Bay Company and its 200-year monopoly that totally reshaped Northern and Western North America. So you'll want to join us for that. And thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Good night.
Thank you.